I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad. Question: so you think your government cares about you? Well, the last few years have shown us with the COVID debate a lot, hasn't it? In countries around the world, some countries wouldn't allow you back in, some wouldn't let you travel, some would see to it that you lost your job if you didn't get the jab. And that I will just briefly allude to, and then I'm going to get into several other topics that maybe you haven't thought about too much, but this is an ongoing trend. As far as I'm concerned, we need a government, we need a civil authority, but the question is how much. I've always been of the belief that the government that governs least governs best. We need them, but they've way overstepped their bounds, and COVID was a perfect example. Remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Became over 2 years of doublespeak, misinformation from the government. And when it was proved that maybe what they told us was wrong, they just doubled down and then did whatever they could to stifle dissent and would not allow any discussion of maybe this was a lab leak from horror of horrors, China. This was something that I found extremely interesting, but the coup de grace, as far as I'm concerned, was when people started losing their jobs because they wouldn't take the jab, even though it was already determined that if you had it, the jab, you could still get COVID and you could still transmit it, which we were told was not the case. But you remember Operation Warp Speed at the end of the Trump administration. And the candidates running against Trump in 2020, both Biden and his vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris, said, well, there's no way that I would take a vaccine that was developed under Donald Trump. Yet a year and a half later, if you didn't take this vaccine, you lose your job. That hasn't been brought out very much. This is one of the things that just ticks me off so much about politics, is they'll say one thing today and something entirely different down the road, thinking you haven't noticed. And sadly, too many people haven't. I don't know how these people live with themselves. I really don't. You think your government cares about you. Have you ever heard of the Tuskegee experiment? I think 1932 to 72, it was what was called the Public Health, PHC, Public Health, and the Center for the Disease Control, the CDC, in conjunction with Tuskegee University in Alabama. And what they did is they took a number of several hundred African-American men with syphilis and made them a part of a study. And the idea was that this would last about 6 months, and the men would get free health care, which lasted for a while. I'm not sure it lasted entirely. But this thing went on for 40 years. They never got treatment for the syphilis, and they were never told of what their condition was. They were just a part of an experiment. And penicillin, one of the great inventions of all time, became available in the late 1940s. 15 years or so after this experiment started, but they wouldn't use that on these men. Well, eventually the governor, I believe it was Bill Clinton, who officially in his administration apologized to the survivors because there were over 100 of these people that died as a result of not getting the proper treatment and so on. And this was one of the great instances where the government actually lied to people. Second, what about the Japanese internment? After World War II had started, remember the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor at Honolulu in December of 1941, which dragged the U.S. into the war with Japan, and then they declared war on Hitler and Mussolini in Europe at the same time. And after this, the United States President Franklin Roosevelt took Japanese American citizens, put them in internment camps, mostly from the western part of the U.S. These camps stretched across much of the United States. I believe there were 10 to 12 camps. The conditions were not deplorable, but they were far from pleasant. Barbed wire around the camps. Some of these people were in these camps for 3 years and separated maybe from family. Now, if their family was with them, they did get to live together, but 3 years, barbed wire, not ideal conditions. American citizens. The Supreme Court wouldn't even rule on they kind of, shirk their responsibility here. They wouldn't rule this totally unconstitutional. And here I find is a great, great irony. Some of these people served in the American military, fighting the Japanese, for heaven's sakes. This is one of the great overlooked crimes of the government in our history. According to history.com, there was a point in time, you remember Prohibition. Well, no one watching this channel today was alive in 1919 when Prohibition was started. The Volstead Act with the 18th Amendment. What did it go from 1919 to 33? It was repealed by the 21st Amendment. Couldn't drink or sell or manufacture alcohol. I think it was over 0.5% in the U.S., 0.5% of alcohol. I don't know how the Canadians managed to get, it was 2.5% before it became an issue for them. But Prohibition during the 1920s, and brilliant idea, huh? Not that I think drinking too much is a good idea, but what did it do? The law of unintended consequences. You get Al Capone and all the gangsters. I love those old gangster shows. I remember seeing all the old reruns of The Untouchables with Robert Stack, great show. But and I like seeing some of the documentaries of the Chicago families during the 20s and 30s as far as crime was concerned. It's a fascinating story, but this was just a dumb idea. But the point is, even before Prohibition, the history.com reports that the government were in favor of putting, I think it was quinine methyl alcohol in some of the alcohol to make it essentially poisonous, to keep people from drinking it. And this, along with some of the bootleggers during Prohibition, killed quite a few people. They estimate well over 10,000 people were killed. So the government was for the idea of poisoning, as it were, alcohol to limit the sale of alcohol. And this was prior to Prohibition. So the question is, you think your government cares about you? And one last thought. I know that a lot of people today, especially in the boomer generation, don't touch my Social Security, don't touch my Medicare. I paid into it. Well, let me say that it is off balance sheet as far as the United States government is concerned. So in other words, it is nothing more than a promise, unlike some of the other expenditures like interest on the debt. It is nothing more than a promise. And I remember President Ford one time saying, any government that is big enough to give you what you want is big enough to take it away from you. I think we need to just be really circumspect in how we think about the government. We need a civil government. We need a civil authority. Government that governs least governs best. We are so far away from that. I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad.